So hello everyone. So today we are going to see about what is JPA and Spring Data JPA. So before starting with Spring Data JPA, which is used in Springboot, we need to understand what is a JPA, right? So JPA it particularly stands for Java Persistence API. Right. Now, what do you mean by this? Now, first let's understand what actually persistence means. Right. So persistence is about saving anything in the database in such a way that whenever we need it, we can retrieve it easily, right? So that property is nothing but persistence, like saving and restoring, right? So similarly, here in the context of Java Persistence API, we are saying that we are saving the Java objects or whatever the data like objects we are creating of Java in the databases using Java code only. Like particularly like it happens in SQL, right? We write different SQL queries to save the data in databases. But here we are going to use Java code only to save Java objects to databases. So that is like if we see an example, like if we have a student which within a reference variable or object as S1, which is having values like ID as 1 and names as gems, right? So here, as you can see, like this is a Java object and we are storing this in the database as represented in the rows and columns, where column is nothing but the field names, that is ID and names, and if we talk about the rows are nothing but the Java objects. Okay, so this type of mapping is particularly done by Java Persistence API. Okay, so JPA is a specification. The second point to remember, and the very main point, it is just a specification. It has no its own implementation, right? Like we can say it has just its own like rules and regulations, like how if you have to insert the data, how the data will be stored, a simple structure. But the internal working about how actually it will be mapped or how this object will be actually stored in the databases, that internal working or that implementation is handled by Hibernate. Okay, so it's just a specification and its implementation is provided by whom? By Hibernate. So whenever we are creating JPA classes or we are working with JPA, we need to import Hibernate dependencies in our project. So in the code, we will see that how this will happen. Next is about the most common used term in JPA, that is ORM. ORM is Object Relational Mapping. So what does it mean? That they are basically responsible for mapping, like as we are saying, that Java objects are going to be stored in the databases, right? As we can say in this example, in this form, right? So this mapping is basically handled or maintained by whom? By the ORM, that is Object Relational Mapping. So this mapping can be of different types, like one to one to many or many to many, etc., which we will see in the code part further. So this ORM is basically responsible for handling these mappings. Okay, so this was about the basic, like what is a JPA. Now next is what are the different architecture, like what is the architecture of JPA, like what different things we have in JPA. So first one is the entity class. Now what do you mean by entity class? Okay, now, entity class is nothing but a simple Java class which we create. Like for if I am having a student class, so what it will have? It will have ID, it will have name, the courses, etc. So that simple class is nothing but a entity class. Okay, but what is going to happen here is here the objects whatever we are creating is just they are going to be stored where in the databases. Okay, so where each data, like what we can say, each Java objects represents a record in database is nothing but an entity. Okay, so entity, they are particularly what they are persistent. Now what do we mean by persistent means they have this, like we can save them easily in the databases, that is why they are persistent, and then each entity is unique. Now how this is happening is like if we talk about, take an example, student. So student will have ID which will be unique for every student, so with this unique ID we can recognize every student, right? So similarly in Java too, like in in the entity class also, we can mark ID as primary key. We will see how it will happen, and these entities that will make each and every entity as unique. that nothing but it represents the unique object. Okay, so like as we have said, like if there is an S1, so there will be ID and name, which will be nothing but the column of our table. That is the fields will be the column of the table. And this one and gem, that is the ID that is corresponding to S1 and gem, that is nothing but the records that will be stored inside the tables. So this are nothing but the rows. Okay, so Java objects are the rows while the fields are the columns. Okay, so as I said, like there are different annotations in order to represent like how my simple Java class will differ with that of the entity class. So for that we have the annotation that is at the rate entity. This is the point to note that whenever we are going to create entity class or a simple Java class, if we want to mark it as entity, we have to give this annotation, right? Now next is at the rate ID, which is basically used to mark a primary key, whatever will be the primary key, that here we are going to use ID suppose. So we are going to mark it with the annotation that is at the rate ID, and next is at the rate table, like when we are going to store the student table in the database, right? So by what table it should be represented, what should be the name of that table. So that is nothing but we are going to give the name in such a way, right? So these are the annotations which are compulsory to be given in the entity classes, right? Now next is, as we have seen the first architecture, that entity class. Now second is about entity manager and entity manager factory. So before that, let's understand what is entity manager factory. So entity manager factory, it is just an interface. Okay, and what is the role of this interface is to maintain the instances, or we can say the objects of entity manager. Okay, so like it basically, like we can say in simple words, that it is basically responsible. Like in JPA, we will have different settings. Like as we are saying that this Java objects will be stored in the databases, right? So for that, we will need to give the link in order to connect, like the URL of our SQL database, that is the workbench and all. So that settings or that configurations will be done by whom? By entity manager factory. Okay, or we can talk about managing entities. It's like saving this records in the table, or whenever we give the command like delete the command, that is nothing but the managing entities. So it basically that it is basically responsible for looking after its duties. It is manager factory. So it is present. So whenever we give this name, that is entity manager factory, whenever we are creating it in our application, we need to import the package, that is java.persistence. Okay. Now, like what is the syntax for it? Like how you will write it in our applications. The syntax for is that first we are going to give the class name, that is entity manager factory. The reference variable for this will be EMF. Then we are going to give, that is persistence dot create entity manager factory. Now what is this? Now let's understand in this one detail. Okay, so what is persistence? So persistent, it is basically responsible for obtaining the entity manager factory object. Okay, and what is create entity manager factory doing? It is basically creating, or what we can say, it is creating an instance. That is, it is creating this EMF instance for entity manager factory, so that it can be used in entity manager, like in the next step. Okay, so for this you need to pass a parameter, that is my persistence unit. So now what is this? So this is nothing but the name that you are going to give to the persistent unit. Like first I'll explain further what is persistent unit, and then we will come back to this. Okay, so this was about the second step, that is entity manager factory. Now third step is about entity manager. Okay, about initialization of entity manager. Now what is entity manager? So it is also an interface. Okay, but what is it is responsible for? Like as we are saying, like we are going to perform, like entity manager factory is responsible for handling, like saving activities in the databases or deleting or all. Okay, so that are nothing but the CRUD operations. So this CRUD operation, that is create, update, delete, etc., they are present in this entity managers. Okay, so they are the one who are going to provide us this CRUD operations. Okay, that is, it is used to interact with the persistence context. It means what key, whatever CRUD operations, like for example for saving, like for a in this database, or if I have to delete this record, so that all operations will be given to be by the entity manager. Okay, so how we are going to define it here in our application is like entity manager, that is a class, that is the name of, sorry, not class, that is the name of the interface. Then the reference variable will be em. This can change, the reference variable we can give it by own, but just they are standardly defined in the what we can say, like in the specification, so we are just using it. Okay, then we have this emf dot create entity manager. Now what we are doing here is, first we what we are doing is emf. So basically with the help of this, we for what we are pointing, we are pointing to the instance of entity manager factory, right? As we have said here that it manages the instances of entity manager factory, right? So in order to manage the instance of em, we need to first, like what we have to locate the entity manager factory instance. So emf is pointing to the entity manager factory instance. Then the create entity manager is what it is doing, it is basically, it says now you can perform like with it, this create entity manager has different methods like find, or we can save, or we can say delete, etc. So with the help of this, we are particularly initializing the entity manager object. Okay, now next is about like the persistent unit. Okay, so like we have said in the entity manager factory, we need to define the persistent unit. So what it is, so it basically, like we can say it is like a box, and in that box you are providing the information like how I will interact with the databases. Okay, or we can say it contains databases connections, like as we are saying that we are giving the url for the database, right? So that connection link we will give here, the JDBC driver link we will give there, or we can say like our SQL, it has a username and password, right? So that all will be mentioned in this persistent unit. So this persistent unit is nothing but a persistent XML file. So you need to create this file, and inside this you can then define different configurations that we want. Okay, and then there is a name of this persistent unit file, so it is defined, or how do you name it as persistent unit name. Okay, this is a common, like we have to use the angular brackets and then persistent unit name, and then here we have to provide the name. This name can vary, and the name that we are giving here, like student details, is going to the entity manager factory, which we have seen here, like my persistence unit, right? That is nothing but the name of a persistent unit file. Okay, so that we can say that as it is handling this JPA settings, like configurations, so for that it will need the links, like if we are saying that the MySQL localhost is for example 3306, so that will be handled only when it knows that where exact the location is, right? So here we are providing that XML file locations, sorry, persistent XML file name. Okay, then next is as we have talked about this, then the second property is like it is about entity mapping. So this is something optional, like suppose if we are working with one or more entity classes, so with the help of this tag, that is class and closing class, okay, we need to define that what like what is the entity, like where is the entity stored, at the package name of that entity. Okay, so this is an optional thing only needed when we are working with more than one entity classes. Okay, and next is like once we are done with the about creating entity manager, manager factory, persistent unit, now next step is that we have to initialize, like we have created the EMF instance, entity manager instance. Now we have to start working with it. So how it happens is we are going to give this should be small. Okay, em dot get transaction, this is the syntax to give that. So now like why get transaction? Okay, so here the transaction basically represents that the database operations that we are performing, like for example saving, updating, deleting, or or we can say anything that we are performing, or just reading, Okay, so that is nothing but the transactions options which we are going to perform, that either if that in a, like suppose we have a one unit, in one unit if we are performing say insertion, deletion, updation, so if any one of like the transaction properties, like if anyone fails, then the all transaction related to it will fail. So it's the same applies here, but just here is that we are working on the database operations like it's CRUD operations. So that get transaction method is used, and then we are setting with dot begin. So this basically, like for example, like if we talk in a simple example, we can say that get transaction tells that the entity manager is begin to work it, and with entity, and you can manipulate whatever the changes or transactions you want to perform with the entity manager. Then dot begin means start, tells the start step, like start doing now, like the manipulation has started. It's like that. Okay. So once like this is needed to be given. Okay. After this, the next step is about saving the data to the database. How it is done? That is em.persist, and here we pass the Java object, that is S1. Okay. So persist about save S1. It's like that. That is entity manager instance dot save S1. It's like that. Okay. And once we are done with all our operations, not just saving, like updating, deleting, etc., then we give this command, that is dot commit, like I am done with everything, whatever the changes I have made, please save it in the database. So this is just a theoretical part related to JPA, like what the code will be, how we are going to implement it. Like in the code, we will have this annotations like entity manager factory. So it will be simply easy to us understand in the coding part. So this is about the theoretical. The next we will see about the coding part. I hope you like this video. Thank you.